Good morning, Michael. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Barry. How are you?
Good. That's very good. Well, I think I know why we convened this Zoom session today. We're going to discuss the last chapter in our exciting mini series on the Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. This last chapter is about anti-Semitism. And as I think we'll discuss, in a way, the subtitles are very important. You were bringing this up before we started recording. Um, the subtitle is important because it suggests something about the relation of modern day World War II era, fascist era, anti-Semitism, to the longer historical narrative that Adorno and Horkheimer have been presenting about the dialectic of enlightenment and the ways in which enlightenment promises and the progressive ideals of the Enlightenment get betrayed by Enlightenment thinkers by the very process of Enlightenment modernization. So fascism, obviously, and the anti-Semitic component of fascism is a very telling terminal case, terminal example, limit case example of the limits of enlightenment as a progressive ideology. So that's a mouthful, but in one way, the end of the story has been foretold. I guess this was our general feeling in reading this chapter. Not that it's unnecessary or an addendum or a minor part of the argument, is that by this point in the book, we have a very clear idea. Adorno and Horkheimer presented this very clear idea of where this particular element and how the present time fits in, corroborates, is a product of this much longer historical process that they've outlined. So I guess, because in a way, our summary, and maybe I can gesture here to the form of this particular episode in the series, because we kind of had this decision that we felt that our summary of their main points are I think we can do this rather briefly. We thought this final episode in the series would also be a good place for us to take stock after we summarize, so to speak, the chapter. We thought this would be a good opportunity. We would still have some room in the podcast, some time in the podcast. And this would be a good space, a good place to sort of give some final thoughts on the entire book in the larger argument of the dialectic of enlightenment. In particular, because this is the big takeaway or the big interest of the Critical Media Studies podcast, we're concerned with what these arguments have to say about the present time. In particular, about the ways in which media circulates meaning and produces subjects and produces societies, the cultural effects of media at the present moment. Right. So we're going to use arguments that were forged in the 1940s to see how they apply or what ways they may apply to 2022. So we're going to try and do that in this episode. So the first part of our charge, as we've defined it, Michael, is that we want to present a summary of what we think is the main argument in the limits of enlightenment, their elements of anti-Semitism chapter.
Yeah, I think
the elements of anti-Semitism chapter.
I think you said it well. I'm going to say it slightly different. The end here, the conclusion, this last chapter isn't, I think you called it a minor end. I don't think it's a minor end, but I do think that it's a predictable end.
That's very disparaging. I'm surprised at my unconscious hostility to the text. Minor end.
I could be projecting, but my point, I guess, is that I think that for me, as I look at this last chapter and what I want to say about it, I think that their conclusion here is a predictable one. I don't think there's any real surprise with their conclusions, but I do think that it is also tidy in the sense that there's one brief section I want to look at that I think does the work that succinctly. But to talk about it, it's going to require that we sort of revisit some of the stuff we talked about with the culture industry in terms of how culture works, which, as you said, gets us back to media. So really, if you don't mind, there's just a couple things, and they come early in this chapter. Let me see here. So in section 2 of this, so really like 2 pages in, the very first line, they say anti-Semitism as
Do you want to screen share for our YouTube audience? Because we want to do everything we can for the YouTube audience.
We do, yes. Give me just a moment here, and it's brief. There's not a whole lot, and if you're listening, thank you, and I'll try and speak clearly here. But here we go. So it starts off, section 2 starts off, anti-Semitism as a popular movement has always been driven by the urge of which its instigators accuse the Social Democrats to make everyone the same, right? So I think if we just pause there for a second, what they're really saying is the roots of anti-Semitism are not terribly different, or not at all different, than one of the aims of the culture industry, right? Which is homogenization. It's the sameness. And so you go just a couple steps further, just this little bit that I have here in yellow. The Aryanization of Jewish property, which in any case primarily benefited those at the top, enriched the masses in the Third Reich hardly more than the wretched booty pillaged from Jewish quarters enriched the Cossacks. In other words, what's the benefit or the payoff for anti-Semitism? There's none. In terms of material benefit, nobody's profiting from this in any meaningful way.
Although their point in this passage is people think they are.
Sure, but I think that's sort of the point, right? The real benefit it brought was a half understood ideology. Right? That the demonstration of its economic futility heightened rather than moderated the attraction of the realist panacea points to its true nature.
The racialist.
Sorry, my fault. It does not help human beings, but assuages their urge to destroy.
Right.
Okay. So to me, this is about identifying yourself in the mass, about belonging, and about needing a scapegoat to confirm your place. That's what this is about, class as much as it's about anti-Semitism. This is about being a part of the, to use Raymond Williams here, right? This is about being a part of the dominant as opposed to being a part of the fringe. So that to me was the thing, because I see this so much in the world today, half understood ideologies, people walking around dropping terms that clearly enable them with one particular group or another, without fully comprehending what it is they're saying or why it is that they're saying these things.
Can we linger here for a moment, and you allow me an aesthete moment where I savor the fierce eloquence of Adorno and Horkheimer, because especially the sentence that you marked, the real benefit it brought was, and you've already underscored the importance of this phrase. It really strikes me when you were reading it how brilliant this phrase is, and it occasioned a lot of thoughts. The real benefit it brought was a half understood ideology. The brilliance of this insight, I think, consists in exactly what you're saying. Nothing is more effective, paradoxically, and nothing is more dangerous, not than ideology, but than a half understood ideology.
Yes.
Because that means, as Adorno and Horkheimer go on to make the point in the rest of this passage that you're emphasizing, you were noting, Michael. They go on to make the case that because this ideology of anti-Semitism, it's precisely because it's half understood that it's so damaging. It is half understood premises mean they can be motivations for action.
But also, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was just going to say they're motivations for action, but then the pleasure that one gets in destruction becomes, its own reward. And in a sense, that can happen despite, regardless of the ideology. There is some, I mean, I think this is the frightening thing that Adorno and Horkheimer realize about anti-Semitism and any half-understood ideology, that the ideology, the actions are compensation for frustrated existence. People, according in their reading,
That's well
people
said.
People have frustrated lives, and if you give people reason, not reasons, but sufficient reason.
If you sanction it.
If you sanction it, thank you. If you use reason as a sanction for a certain kind of action, but really you're sanctioning violent behavior. And the problem with violent behavior is that it becomes its own rationale very quickly, because there's a pleasure in destruction.
But not only that, it clearly puts you in the right.
Absolutely.
So like if we go down to just finish the paragraph, the actual advantage enjoyed by the racialist comrade is that his rage will be sanctioned by the collective.
Oh, they use that verb later. Yeah, you're right.
The less but this is to your point though, the less he gains in any other way, the more obstinately against better knowledge he clings to the movement. Anti-Semitism has proved immune to the charge of inadequate profitability. For the common people, it is a luxury. And so there is your rage becomes righteousness. And the ability to express your rage is your payoff. That is your gain.
I think the psychological, I mean, I think eventually we're going to say, judging from our pre-discussions, we're going to say that this chapter sort of confirms or is an example of Adorno and Horkheimer using maybe predominantly referring back to the Marxist paradigm, a Marxist analysis, to the premises or methodologies of Marxist analysis. Nonetheless, there's a lot of Freud in this, there's a lot of psychology in these anti-Semitism chapter, especially in these passages that we've been earmarking. This idea that another term from Freud that I think it's hovering over. Ideology is a term that I think it's pretty clear that Adorno and Horkheimer are taking from Marx. But when they say half understood ideology, when they delineate and sort of emphasize the powerful effects that a half understood ideology might have, the political effects it might have, I think here's where we see, and it's obviously not the first time we see it in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, but here we see the presence of Freud. Here we see, because I think another term, I think they don't mention the Freudian unconscious as a motivating factor in human psychology, but I think that's kind of what they're playing with and presuming. That's what's submerged, so to speak, in this argument.
No,
so there's Freud here. There's Freud here as well as Marx.
Sure. I was going, I think I sort of missed the window on this a little bit, but I was going to tie this back to the culture industry in terms of the sanctioning and how that's done. And this idea, well, I don't think it's a long discussion, but this idea that, what we see in the media in order to be effective needs to be a version of myself that is equally plausible, right? So I have to be able to see myself in this. And through that sort of psychological positioning, you create an element of control, which is profound, right? And so this idea of media being the same, movies, radio being the same, and designed to a specific end is really, I think, how this is done. So this, to me, again, speaks. This is why I found this so interesting and terrifying simultaneously, is because I see so many parallels to this to now that are frightening. So that was my the thing that I had an idea to connect it earlier, but I just wanted to come back and say that social sanctioning, I think, is what to me, connected this to the culture industry most clearly.
Well, maybe we can transition from this, since you brought up media. Maybe this is the point. If you allow me, I wanted to bring in another text to sort of round off this discussion. Here it is. I'll show it to our YouTube viewers. Late Marxism by Frederick Jameson. He makes a point about this chapter that I think this tallies. We agree with the great Frederick Jameson, so we're being highly original in this. That I think we collectively, Michael and I collectively, felt that in this final chapter, Adorno and Horkheimer maybe make clear, or they are most overtly returning to a Marxist mode of analysis in order to explain and interpret modern anti-Semitism, in that they're basically explaining anti-Semitism as a psychological phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
They're basically relating that to inequities and inequalities and failed promises of capitalism, failed promises or pressures in the social system. So in the sense that this is a Marxist analysis, or I'll read a Jameson quote.
Yeah.
But before I do, let me tag something for the future. In what you just said, Michael, very helpfully, in talking about social sanction and the ways in which media helps sanction certain kinds of behavior, including anti-Semitism, then and now. I think that's what we're going to return to in the last portion of this episode. The ways in which the picture of media, and particularly the vision of media as a culture industry in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, the ways in which that pertains or doesn't pertain to our current media landscape. But just one more, I'm going to circle back one last time to the anti-Semitism chapter. So I think both Michael and I agreed that there was a strong pronounced social emphasis in this particular chapter, by which I mean that anti-Semitism is a psychological phenomenon. They certainly treat it as was evident in the passage that Michael just read. Adorno and Horkheimer realized there's important psychological dynamics going on and being expressed in anti-Semitic prejudice. But they, in the last mode of analysis, in the last instance, they feel this psychology is very much a social psychology. It's the product of pent-up feeling and aggression and frustration at inequities, the everyday injustice of living in a capitalist social order. That's why we think this chapter is where they return to Marxism, maybe most explicitly. And Frederick Jameson makes a similar point about the work of this chapter in the larger project of the Dialectic of Enlightenment. And I guess we just want to emphasize that might be a way of interpreting what's going on in this chapter in relation to the rest of the book. So, even in the chapter of Dialectic of Enlightenment, officially consecrated to anti-Semitism, Jameson writes in late Marxism. Even in the chapter of Dialectic of Enlightenment, officially consecrated to anti-Semitism, this phenomenon is not as it is for liberalism. Let me insert here. Is not as it is for liberalism. And Jameson is implying that a Marxist analysis, he's trying to differentiate Adorno and Horkheimer's Marxist analysis from a liberal analysis of society. So even in the chapter of D of E, officially consecrated to anti-Semitism, the phenomenon is not, as it would be for liberalism, a mere aberrant empirical matter, which may be studied in isolation from late capitalism generally, but is in its function and also in its significance as a psychic symptom. So even this psychological element of anti-Semitism, Jameson says, Adorno and Horkheimer even want to bring a discussion of the psychology of anti-Semitism back to an analysis of, resume reading Jameson, the social totality itself. So in other words, this is their most marks, and this is worth remarking because we've seen a lot of Freud in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, even though there's an entire chapter highly critical of Nietzsche's attack on morality. There is a strong sense in many of the passages, the passages on Odysseus, and also the passage on Kant, really reads like, outtakes from Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. So there's a lot of Nietzsche in here, even though Nietzsche is an object of Adorno and Horkheimer's critique. Nonetheless, in the anti-Semitism chapter, as Jameson notes, and I think we are agreeing with Jameson, there's a kind of return. There's a strong return to a Marxist analysis that says that even a social symptom, even a psychological symptom like anti-Semitism, has to be explained by the mode of production. Now that maybe right there is a segue to media, to our discussion of media, because it's not just like returning to society. It's not just as in terms of a Marxist analysis of anti-Semitism. Adorno and Horkheimer want us to be aware of society. What makes that Marxist is that they want us to attend to modes of production. And if we talk about modes of production, I think we're right back into this idea that you already talked about, Michael, that the mode of production right now for everything, including art, is the culture industry.
Right.
And so that maybe that's a segue to, if you want to take it from here or just begin our discussion, maybe that's a segue to our takeaways, to our discussion of what we think might be relevant to something in this text that we haven't talked about, that we think might be relevant to contemporary media studies.
Which is, I'm assuming we're talking here about radio now.
Well, we're talking about the culture industry.
Right.
And so, yeah, we're talking about radio.
Well, I mean radio because...
Why would radio... Do you want me to read why radio might be a problem?
No, I think let's chat about this before, because there's a section in the culture industry chapter which brings us back to this. But if we're talking about the Marxist argument and the production, the problem that radio presents that is different or unique compared to film is that it's a non-commodified entity, right?
It presents itself as, in other words, as a public service.
Right. It's free. It is a public good. And so the question of, radio as a commodity is a different discussion than what we did with film. And so do you want to jump into this?
I can, just to sort of
I have the section pulled up if you want to.
About the radio?
Yeah.
Well, let me say just one quick thing, and then let's go to the passage. I don't want to belabor the point, but just sort of to make sure that we're all clear about why radio would be a kind of stepping point to thinking about the culture industry, but also current manifestations of the culture industry, if they exist today. And this, again, is taking off from a point Frederick Jameson makes. He argues that radio is something that Adorno and Horkheimer... So the culture industry chapter that we discussed, was it last time? I guess it was.
Yes.
The culture industry chapter largely focuses on Hollywood. But there is a discussion of radio and television as well. And Jameson says, and I think we agree with this, I guess this is one of the things that you and I should maybe talk about as we go along here. Jameson is making an argument. There's an argument here, and maybe Jameson is wrong, but he feels that there's a kind of tension in the culture industry argument. And we didn't talk about this in the culture industry episode. Jameson feels there's a tension in this argument because with Hollywood, it makes sense to talk about Hollywood movies as a commodity because you're paying for it no matter what, right? And even if it's cheap, even if it's a relatively cheap commodity, it's very obviously a commodity. And you have celebrity status that is being reined in and produced for the sake of the commodity system. Mm-hmm. Movies have to make a profit. So it's obvious. So the claim that, well, Hollywood is media, and media is obviously constructed around industrial modes of production. And so therefore, Hollywood is a culture industry. That's a kind of that's a tight argument. But Jameson says radio presents a problem with that because ineluctably, no matter what, because of the nature of the technology, and maybe the internet is a parallel here, or maybe not. With radio, I'll use the BBC. I think I did this when we were talking about it before, Michael. I used the BBC as an example. The BBC was defined by law. It's different from America, right? Mm-hmm. BBC was defined by law as a state organized broadcasting channel. And why was the state running it? Because it was assumed that radio, because everyone had free access to it, was a service. And therefore, if it was a service, it should be under the auspices of the state. So Jameson says, well, this presents an argument here. Yeah, radio has a problematic place in this argument because radio, it's not obvious that radio is a commodity. Because there is at least a discourse around radio and something about the nature of the technological medium itself that suggests that it's harder to commodify. So I guess that's the subject under discussion. And maybe does that set up the quote? Maybe
it does. I'm gonna throw a second insight into this that I want to have sitting on the back burner here, because one of the so we've Horkheimer and Adorno discussed how film works in the culture industry, and one of the things that you had just mentioned there. So to just revisit it briefly, the argument is that the films that are produced and the product that we consume, it exists as a certain banality, a certain sameness that requires that ends with that has a leveling effect, right? There's not a whole lot. It's what's their term for it? It's common art. I forget what the term they use for it, but it's a simple art. Maybe I forget what I'm
forgetting their term, but the other terms that come to mind are standardized.
Yeah, but
production has to be standardized, regularized, and therefore not predictable. Predictable
in the name of economic concerns.
Right.
What's interesting about so you have Hollywood and Hollywood's functioning as a result of certain economic necessities.
Yeah.
What's interesting in the argument that Adorno and Horkheimer put forth is that it drips of McLuhan ahead of McLuhan, where you have radio functioning not according to economic concerns, because it's not an economic commodity, but it functions more along the lines of, excuse me, I didn't want to use that word. It works more along the lines of function. In other words, if you go back to McLuhan's argument about the medium is the message, right? The medium itself becomes the thing. That becomes the thing we need to focus on. Ignore the content, it's the container. And I think that you have an interesting sort of distinction between the economic implications of cinema and the form considerations of radio. Let me share the screen.
I think this is you perfectly teed up the passage we wanted to look at.
Well, let's take a peek here. So for those of you watching, here you go. For those of you listening, here you go.
We're going to read in a really exciting manner, right? It's going to be dramatic.
It's my radio voice. Here we go. So in America, radio. In America, it levies no duty from the public, no charge.
So they're acknowledging that, just to break in,
It's free.
they're acknowledging what Jameson said might be a trouble point for them. They're acknowledging the free aspect, the public service aspect.
It is not, there are no economic concerns here, right? It thereby takes on the deceptive form of a disinterested, impartial authority, which fits fascism like a glove.
Ouch! Ouch!
In fascism, but see, this is the wave of McLuhan coming at you. In fascism, radio becomes the universal mouthpiece of the Führer. In the loudspeakers on the street, his voice merges with the howl of sirens proclaiming panic, from which modern propaganda is hard to distinguish in any case.
Let's stop. We got to stop there for an aesthetic moment. This brilliant reader in this PDF did you do this? Or is this in the PDF already? Who circled sirens in red? Was that you?
That was me.
You're a brilliant reader, Michael.
Thank you.
We have to stop a moment to congratulate ourselves, because you're a good close reader. What should we think about here? I mean, this is really kind of brilliant as a formal technique. What is where have we seen sirens before?
Oh, look at you. This is Odysseus all over again.
This is Odysseus over. So this is a way in which.
But that's right.
I mean, this is the exciting thing about the book. I think this is not a real digression, because this is something we should talk about in a summation episode, isn't it? Because they really constructed this as a narrative, right? The Dialectic of Enlightenment is a historical narrative. That's what I was thinking of when I was comparing it to Genealogy of Morals. It's a sort of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. It's a very critical alternative view of history. And so, but it's also a narrative. Dialectic of Enlightenment, they constructed, Adorno and Horkheimer constructed as a narrative. So now the sirens, silenced by Odysseus and in Homer, they reappear in the radio broadcast of the Führer.
Right.
That's the end of the story. That's the end of the story.
Shall I continue?
Okay, I just wanted to say how brilliant that was. And so there you go.
There we go. I never knew circling with a red pen could.
It gets me very excited. Yeah.
There you go. Well, you're welcome. The National Socialists knew that broadcasting gave their case stature as the printing press did to the Reformation. The Führer's metaphysical charisma, invented by the sociology of religion, turned out finally to be merely the omnipresence of his radio address, which demonically parodies that of the divine spirit. The gigantic fact that the speech penetrates everywhere replaces its content, as the benevolent act of the Tuskegee broadcast supplants its content.
Do we have drinking games for the Critical Media Studies podcast?
We don't, but
every time. We don't.
I'm assuming you listening do, and we'll take a moment free to gather yourself.
Take a drink. Maybe we should have sound effects every time we mention either McLuhan or Taylor Swift, like we did in our last episode. There should be a drinking game. But everything about those last two sentences you read, our listeners who have struggled with us through McLuhan, who have labored with us through McLuhan, we need to invoke them, right? The fact that the speech as a form penetrates everywhere, replaces its content. This is precisely McLuhan's argument about how media forms work,
right?
To replace content. It's exactly the argument. What do you think? I'll just say that I think it's brilliant. Maybe you'll have something more substantive to say if I return to that prior sentence where they suggest that the metaphysical charisma, the charisma that we ascribe to Adolf Hitler himself, it turns out also to be a function, to use your word, of media. It turns out to be merely the omnipresence of his radio addresses. Now, I'm going to try to gloss that. I think that's a brilliant observation. Let me see if I can gloss it, and you tell me whether you agree with my gloss. I think what they're saying is Hitler has no intrinsic divine properties.
Okay.
An easy proposition to make. But why do people, even intelligent people, think, oh, no, he must be horribly, tremendously, powerfully charismatic? Because look at the effects of his speeches. And to that comment, I think Adorno and Horkheimer in that sentence are saying nonsense. That you are to say that Hitler has an essence is to misunderstand the power of media. That it's merely the omnipresence of the radio voice of Hitler that gives him the ersatz charisma or appeal that generates activity and a response in the masses.
Well,
That's my gloss of it.
But I think that's right, and I think that we see that today. You know, if you can be at the forefront of the form, then your fame is derived from your visibility or from your I mean, even though we're talking about radio, I'll still use visibility as the term here, right? Like because he is the focus of this, because he is the voice you hear, he is what's in the container. So we take that to be, you know, this. I think again, this was sort of the thing that people who read McLuhan struggle with. It's not the content; it's the container, right?
Yeah,
If you put
exactly.
Hitler in the container, you're going to focus on Hitler, missing the fact that it's the container itself.
The container. That's the included message. Yeah.
I think that's it, and I think we see that. You know, I mean, this is social media. This is I mean, I'm not trying to compare social media people to Hitler. Don't misunderstand. That's not the.
You are.
I did no such thing. But I think that's the argument, is that you know, his, what is it? The Führer's metaphysics invented by the sociologist turned out finally to be merely the omnipresence of his radio address, right? What we think of as charisma is just his ubiquity.
Omnipresent ubiquity. Yes. Wonderfully said. Let's get out of the screen share, and I have a question for you because I think we're at the close.
All right.
I'm going to make a comment, and I'm going to throw it to you, and maybe I'll have a comment in response. But I think we're kind of drawn to a close of our discussion, because I think now we did the second part of what I promised at the beginning, that we're thinking about an aspect of the culture industry argument that we didn't discuss in our episode on the culture industry chapter, but that might be a parallel that might be worth considering in order to make sense of the current situation, the current media environment or media ecology. So let's return to the quote just briefly. What we were detecting McLuhan in that quote. So what's the takeaway from that, or what's the larger meaning of that? We think that Jameson's right. The radio. I'm going to try to summarize some points, and then you fill in or disagree or whatever. So Jameson makes the argument that radio has a problematic role within the culture industry argument because of its free nature, its public service association with public service or state apparatus. And looking at that passage, we think maybe Jameson, has a point, but maybe only a point, in the sense that passage suggests that Adorno and Horkheimer, before McLuhan, have a very easy, can definitely sort of answer the objection that, well, radio isn't a commodity. And they seem to answer that objection by pointing out the fact that the media is the message, that the container of media has leveling, standardizing, dominating effects. So that even though radio may not appear to be a commodity product or subject to the same mode of production that Hollywood film is, it has the same effects of, as we've been talking about throughout this episode, of limiting and constructing and inhibiting human consciousness and perpetuating structures of domination and reproducing a kind of cultural leveling, a cultural sameness. So, I mean, does that sound like a fair gloss? And then if you think it is a fair gloss, then I have a question.
No, I'm okay with that. I'd like to hear your question before I say.
Okay. Well, that I think is what that passage, that's why we were looking at that passage, because it seems like they realize that radio is something different, but I think they seem to be implying fairly clearly that radio has effects that are not unlike the rest of the culture industry. So I think that's how they address that argument, and I think they convince me and persuade me in that fact. Okay, so my question for you is this. I think one of the reasons why we were fascinated with the place of radio in the culture industry chapter is because, in a way, many of the rationales for the internet, or many of the claims made for radio in the 20s and 30s and 40s and beyond, actually, and for were and are made for the internet. That the main thing that you need to do to liberate people is just to give them access to the internet. Insofar as you do that, that is progress, because the internet is a service. It's a necessity, even. And just increasing its circulation. Now, that passage that you read talks about the dangers of media ubiquity or omnipresence. Ubiquity was your word. Omnipresence, their word.
So
the internet, I mean, that seems to be how we justify or legitimate the internet, or sanction, to use your other word, the internet now. We say, listen, the internet, the problem with the internet is we don't get enough of it, or enough people don't get enough of it. So is that the parallel or no?
Well,
or no?
Maybe. Let me answer this. I'm going to try and take as straight a line through this as possible, because I don't want to wander around the bushes too much here. But I think it's important that if we're going to try and draw this parallel between the internet and radio, I think it's important to sort of couch the way that radio functions for Adorno and Horkheimer in terms of their larger argument in the book, which is about the Enlightenment, right? So if you think about so radio is not a commodity, right? That's the problem. It's a free public good, okay? But in terms of the Enlightenment, it's a tool, but it's more than that. It's a scientific tool, okay? And what that scientific tool does, and this is where I think you can make the connection to the internet, is that it connects us to something authentic and true. It connects us to the Führer himself, right? We get to hear this word. You're laughing. Give me a moment, right?
I'm just thinking about the comments on YouTube that we'll be getting. Go ahead, please.
So I don't think it needs to go there. If it does, it does, right? But the idea is that there's let me rephrase this then. There's an authenticity.
There's an authenticity that gives us access to
right. And so in the case of the Horkheimer Adorno, it's the Führer or the sirens or whatever, whomever.
We'll say the sirens.
But it is a tool,
right,
that is scientific in nature and has all of the trappings of truth and authenticity and legitimacy, right? This creates that sanctioning, which leads us to fascism. Okay. If you look at the internet, in a way, I feel like it operates under the same set of enlightened, and I use that with the little air quotes, premises, right? That this is about access, and that access equals progress, because access to what? Well, we assume access to the authentic, access to the valuable, access to something that is somehow, in some mythical way, different than the culture industry and different than the leveling properties of the culture industry, which will take us to this wasteland. And so I think that they're comparable, I think, certainly in the sense that you have to look at them as tools and as mediums where the content is perhaps less significant than the tool itself. And then the question becomes, well, in what service is this tool being levied?
That's a great point.
That's where I would get off with that. I think there's certainly comparisons, but I think that the comparison has to be couched in the conception of, this idealism behind both technologies.
Would you agree that we kind of need, I mean, seems to be a really forceful argument that we need McLuhan to, I mean, I was laughing because, I always force, as listeners or watchers of Critical Media Studies podcast knows, I'm always pushing Michael to acknowledge the greatness and omnipresence and ubiquity of McLuhan. And he's always pushing Taylor Swift on me. And, and he obliges and I oblige. But, I loved your answer I loved your comment there. And I'm wondering, you're making me think that McLuhan really is genuinely helpful and that he gives us a bridge. He gives us a way to connect their analysis of radio as a media form with the ways in which the internet as media form functions today. I mean, McLuhan helps us see, make a bridge from what their analysis to maybe a more contemporary analysis.
I think that, yes, I think that especially the way that this passage that we talked about today is written, I think that's a nod that, I'm not going to say that McLuhan is dead right all the time and that this is how we have to see things. I think that's a very limiting.
Me.
Yeah, and that's fine. That's fine. I don't want to be, to be trampling on your daydreams here or your dreams, but I think that in this regard, it's highly useful because it provides Adorno and Horkheimer the answer that they need. Yeah. To say, well, here's what we do with radio, or here's how we understand radio functioning as a part of the culture industry. And I think that it certainly is useful in trying to contextualize or make an argument for how we can see the idealist, the what's the word I'm looking for? The dream of the internet, right? Like what the internet is supposed to be.
Well put. Very well put. Lovely answer. I think we're in our final moments, but I think we reached a close, but let's do something special for the holidays, Michael. I'm going to ask you a question that you're not prepared for.
That's most questions. That's most questions.
And I'm going to try to answer it too. I'm going to try to answer my own question.
What you got?
But this is just in the spirit of the holidays. It's also in the spirit of our leave taking with this book that we've lingered on for a while now. And in the not so much a takeaway, but just sort of a summation point. So along those lines, I'm going to ask you a question, and we may have to stop tape and then again. But I think
let's full speed ahead. What do you have?
Keep it
rolling.
What do you have? Okay, now that we've read this book, who do you think needs to read this book? To whom would you recommend this book to? Or maybe a better way of putting it. No, wait. Okay, I'm gonna put my question better. What do you think are arguments that our listener from this book? What are the arguments that you read that we've talked about that you think that reader should keep in mind as they go forward? Like, what are the important? I am asking about the takeaway.
Yeah.
But I'm asking it in the most exalted way.
I think you
haven't read this book. Why is it a problem that you haven't read this book? What am I going to tell you? Okay, unless you read this book, you're not going to understand X.
So I think, so I'm going to give you a big answer.
Well, that's what I'm asking for.
I think if you don't, unless you read this book, it is unlikely, I'm not going to say you won't, it is unlikely that you will see the world in the way that this book asks you to see it, and that's a non-answer. So to circle back, what I took from this book was just a series of perspectives about the world as a series of cause and effects built on certain assumptions that we swallow blindly as good, right? The first thing, this was a hard read for me.
I think it's a
So
hard
when you
read for
said,
everyone because it's polymath, right?
and when you
It's
said, so
encyclopedic.
who needs to read this book?
Yeah.
I don't know, right? But who needs to be talking and thinking about the book's contents? I think all of us. And the reason for it is, you know, we live in an era of big data where we take, you know, and I have friends in mathematics who will probably find me and hurt me for this, but who take numbers and statistics and science as an absolute truth. This to me is the argument for liberal studies. This to me is the argument for long form discussion. This for me is the argument about a slow, considered response as opposed to check the box, move on. This is an incredibly important book. It is incredibly challenging, and incredibly dense, and incredibly confusing book. But I think that the value in this is to look long and hard at a lot of our preconceived truths about the value of efficiency and the value of, you know, absolute certainty, and the real dangers in basing your worldview upon those things. Because quite frankly, I know they exist, but I am not of the opinion that they are always the best way through. And in a world driven by capitalism and consumption, these are anathema to the way the world is lived. There's my not short, and I don't know how incredibly coherent answer. What's yours?
I think your answer may not have been short, but it was incredibly coherent and incredibly powerful and eloquent, and I have little to add to it. In fact, I think I have nothing to add to it, except I'll just say one last sentence. And you already implied what I'm going to say. My quick takeaway, and I like your longer takeaway, and I would like it to be our capstone statement. So I'll just underscore a point you made. For someone familiar, for someone familiar with Western culture history, this is a real eye-opener because it offers an important alternative perspective on Western intellectual history. But I would go further than that, as you do, and I would say that just by virtue of living in a capitalist, consumerist, technology-driven, scientific society that assumes that the next product you buy, the next technological device or technological advance necessarily constitutes progress and should be esteemed and valued simply because it is the most timely, fashionable, technological, advanced thing going. That even if you live in this world, regardless of what you know about Western history, you're going to be inundated and shaped by and determined. I think your notion of reason and the normative, everyday, your notion of the everyday life is going to be shaped and I think limited by this perspective, just by virtue of being alive and a thinking being on this date, 12/9/2022. So since we're all living in this current society and we are imbued with its worldview, like it or not, I think this book is an important corrective.
Yeah.
It presents a powerful alternative. But I guess, to link up with another thing you said, it has to be challenging. And it is challenging. It has to be a challenging read. And, the reason why this might be a daunting task is that it is a challenging read. It requires you to know a lot. You're going to have to read this in concert with other books in order to make sense of it. So, there's the challenge of the book, but is it worthwhile? I think it is for all the reasons you said.
Barry, thank you. I've enjoyed it, and again, this project came as a result of a listener suggestion. So if there is stuff you'd like us to discuss, stuff you'd like to discuss, by all means, reach out and let us know. We're open to suggestion. This was a good one, and I think it was time well spent. And I hope you did too.
Can't say it better. Thank you,
All right.
Michael, for everything.
All right, Barry. Take care.
Bye-bye.